Welcome to Boston Virtual ARTCC's Ground School on this Labor Day Monday. Tonight we are talking about instrument approach procedures, the second in our two-part series. Last week on Monday, Alec presented the introduction to instrument approach procedures, talking about more of the theory concepts, so looking at some definitions, talking about minimums, talking about circling, and other rules that are applicable to procedures. Today we're going to look at the more practical side, actually flying a lot of these procedures and talking about what certain symbols mean, how you might fly a procedure from a specific waypoint, and going in that direction, talking about some briefings and actually dealing with how we would fly these procedures. And today, Krikor is going to take us through that. So without any further ado, welcome you all to tonight's session on instrument approach procedures. And Krikor, take it away.
Good evening, guys. Thanks for joining us again. It's your friendly neighborhood Armenian Krikor here. I was sorry to miss you all last week, but look forward to getting into some instrument stuff today. And like Evan mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about the practical side to flying instrument approaches. So last week, Alec and Evan discussed a lot of the details and procedures and regulations that apply to instrument approaches. And that video is available on YouTube now for anyone who missed that session. Today, we're going to talk about interpreting instrument approach procedures, looking at the approach charts, the information that's on them, and taking that information and applying it in the cockpit and being able to actually fly these procedures. So the first thing we're going to talk about a little bit are the different types of charts. There's two main types when it comes to flying in the US. There's the government charts, which is what most people are going to be accustomed to. They're generally available for free from a variety of sources, specifically for flight simulation. You can find them from AirNav, SkyVector, and there's a whole bunch of other websites that have them available. FlightAware also has them, I believe. They're available on mobile platforms. Flightplan.com provides these charts for free. I think you need to have an account with them, but I'm not certain about that. And
it's a great mobile app, though. If you don't want to pay for ForeFlight or for even the Navigraph charts, looking at just downloading the free Flight Plan Go app, I think you need a free account there, but you basically get almost all the features of ForeFlight, at least for the virtual pilot, and it's free, and you can connect it to your simulator, so you can actually see your airplane geo-referenced on the approach chart. It's really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And there are also government published charts available for other countries. These are available on ChartFox. You can actually get them directly from Eurocontrol or from, in a lot of other countries, you can Google the country and then AIP, and I forget what that stands for, Aeronautical Information Packet or something like that, and it'll have all those charts in it. Part of the problem with that is that they're consistent within one country, but the format and symbology on those charts will change depending on which country you're in. So if you look at government published charts for the United Kingdom, which are published by NATS and are available free online, they look completely different from the FAA published charts. Now, if you're only flying in the United States and you become accustomed to the FAA's government charts, they're all the same. Whether you're in Boise, Idaho or Boston, Massachusetts, they're the same. But if you're doing international flights, you're going into Canada, you're going to Mexico, you're going across to Europe or Asia, they're going to be completely different. On the left here, we have an example, which is the government chart for the ILS runway 4 right at Boston Logan. And we're going to get into what everything on that chart means here in a few minutes. The comparison is Jefferson charts. They are generally not available for free. You may be able to find some online or possibly with an add-on scenery or something like that. But generally speaking, you have to pay for them, and it's usually $100 or $200 a year, something like that. They come generally from real-world sources. Most airlines purchase these charts from Jefferson, who's owned by Boeing, and will provide them to their pilots, or you can purchase them through Navigraph, where you'll get a simulation version of the chart. It's the same thing. It just says not for flight. That's what Navigraph uses in their new charts package. They are available on mobile platforms. Navigraph has an app that lets you pull these charts up, and also ForeFlight, which is a real-world electronic flight bag pay subscription. They have Jefferson charts available as an option as well. I use them for my real-world flying, and I know a couple of the people who do. One of the major benefits to Jefferson charts is that they're available for the entire world. So if you're flying an ILS into Boston, it's going to have the same symbology, the same look, the same feel as if you're flying in Pyongyang, North Korea. They look exactly the same, and they actually do publish charts for Pyongyang. Fun fact.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah, they do. I got bored and looked it up once. So that's the biggest advantage to them, especially if you're doing a lot of international flying. It allows you to become familiar with the same format of the chart. There also are differences in the way the charts are published. They look a little bit different. Jefferson uses color, whereas the FAA is generally, for the most part, black and white. I personally think Jefferson charts are better, but that's a personal preference. I know people who swear by government charts as well. So Those are the two different types of charts. Today, we're primarily going to focus on the government charts. More simulation people will use them. They're generally more freely available and easier to access for flying in the US. However, we will talk a little bit about Jefferson charts, and we're going to look at a Jefferson chart as well a little bit later in the session.
I'll point out that whichever chart preference you have, whether it's government or Jefferson, the nice thing is that you can access all of them in an iPad or EFB tablet app, and all of them are able to be georeferenced. So you can actually see your simulator airplane right on the ILS chart, which makes it really easy when you're flying instrument approaches or when you're taxiing around the airport. You actually see your airplane right there on the chart. That makes it a lot easier to be able to actually navigate. Dave, did you have a question? Or somebody else had a question? No? Okay. Anyway, if you do have any questions, guys, feel free to use the chat as we've done in previous sessions, or just unmute your microphone here in Google Meet and ask away. Sorry to interrupt, Krikor.
Nope, you're all good. Thank you, Evan. And the other thing too is both of these are perfectly acceptable charts, both in the simulation world and in the real world. They both show the same information. It's just formatted a little bit differently. Like Evan said, you can find them for, or like we both said, you can find them for free online using flightplan.com or the mobile app. And then you can access Jefferson charts for a monthly subscription through Navigraph, which is pretty reasonable. It's not a crazy cost. It's like $8-9 a month, something like that. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's not outrageous, and certainly it's cheaper than a actual subscription through ForeFlight. Like we talked about, we're mostly going to use the government charts for the purposes of this session. The formats change, the information's the same. So if you are used to using government charts and you decide, hey, we want to make the transition over to Jefferson charts, you just need to become a little bit familiar with where the information is, how it's laid out a little bit differently, stuff like that. And we will have an example approach briefing, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today at the end of the session, using a Jefferson plate and kind of show you some of the key differences with that chart.
We don't have an example here in the slides, but we did talk about it last week. The FAA publishes an instrument flying handbook and also a chart user guide. So if you're ever wondering what does this symbol mean on a chart, you can just Google FAA, instrument chart guide basically, and you'll find that particular publication. It gives you every symbol that's used on sectionals, on IFR en route charts, and then on actual airport charts as well. So if you're ever wondering what does this symbol mean, you can usually find it in that document.
Cool. There are a couple different portions of the chart that we're going to talk about today. FAA charts and Jefferson charts as well generally have a plan view and a profile view. So using information from both of those allows you to build a three-dimensional picture of the approach. So you can see on the left there, we have the plan view. This is kind of a top-down view. It shows you the location generally to scale, and there are some exceptions that we're going to talk about, but it shows you the different fixes on the approach, the final approach course, the airport, any terrain or water that's nearby, anything like that. And that provides you with effectively the lateral portion of the approach, where you're turning, what direction you're flying, that type of thing. On the right, we have the profile view, which is kind of from the side, and it's really displaying the vertical portion of the approach. So it shows you at what point you're able to descend, where the final approach fix is. It's going to show you what your minimum altitude and visibility requirement is, and some stuff like that. So those two portions are both important for you to be able to interpret, and that's what we're going to focus on now. So the plan view kind of usually looks like this. This is the ILS runway 11 approach into Portland, Maine. And you can see there's a whole bunch of information on it. So we're going to kind of break this down and talk about things one portion at a time. Over here on the left, we have a feeder route. And you guys should have talked about this last time. In fact, I think you used this exact example. But you have the VOR, that's the beginning of the feeder route, which is in this case is the Concorde VOR. And so you have information, the frequency, the Morse code, the identifier, the channel, all that stuff. And then you have a line that symbolizes your feeder route. And the way we know this is a feeder route, there's a couple different ways. A good clue is the fact that you have this kind of bolded arrow as opposed to just the radial line. It shows you the magnetic course, so 067 degrees. It shows you the minimum en route altitude, which is 3,500 feet between High Cod and Parso. And it shows you the distance, which is 11.4 nautical miles from High Cod to Parso. The other thing that you have is the High Cod intersection. And so this is where these charts get a little bit clustered. You'll actually notice here there's these squiggly lines. That denotes that that segment is not to scale. So the distance between Concorde and High Cod is actually significantly further than the difference, or the distance, excuse me, between High Cod and Parso. So if we were actually flying this approach, let's say we're coming in from the southwest, we'd proceed direct to the Concorde VOR. So we'd tune that in either to the GPS or the Nav1 radio, fly direct Concord, and then we would depart Concord on the 067 radial. For that initial segment between Concord and High Cod, our minimum en route altitude is 4,100 feet, so we could descend to 4,100. And when we are at 33 miles, which you can see down here, or this little DME box where it has a line on one side and an arc on the other, that's what tells us the distance. At 33 DME from Concord, on the 067 radial is the High Cod intersection. If our airplane didn't have DME, another way of identifying that fix would be the intersection of the 067 radial off of Concord and the 314 radial off of Kennebunk. And you'll notice throughout this entire approach, there's a ton of radials, right? And it seems a little bit excessive. The reason is that provides us with a ton of options for identifying those fixes. If our airplane had 2 VORs, but we didn't have any GPS, we didn't have any DME, that's how we would be able to do it. So we would cross High Cod on the 067 radial at 4,100 feet. Once we have passed that intersection, we could descend to 3,500 feet and continue to Parso, at which point we'd intercept the final approach course and then continue the approach from there. Speaking of Parso, that's up here. You can see it's an initial approach fix. That's what IAF in the brackets denotes on top of the fix. Parso, of course, is the 5-letter identifier. You can identify it by the IPWM, and that is the localizer in this case, at 21 DME. So generally, you would fly the 067 radial, join the final approach course inbound, and that is that's how you can identify Parso. And at that point, you would fly the remainder of the approach as a straight in. Down here we have Kennebunk. Kennebunk is a relatively important VOR on this. Approach, both because it serves as a feeder route and it serves as a way of identifying a number of fixes. So the feeder route is this bolded arrow that comes off of it on the 030 radial. The minimum en route altitude in this case would be 2,300 feet. You'd fly that for 14.4 miles until you get to Buckstow, which is an intermediate fix, which is the IF up there. And then again, you would join the final approach course and proceed straight in. But like we said, there's a ton of other radials, right? We've got 314, 352, 008. There's a number of other radials that are coming off of the Kennebunk VOR, and all of those are just used to identify other fixes. So we could identify Parso using a variety of radials that are available, but among them is the Kennebunk 352 radial. We could identify Mena here at 6.6 DME by the Kennebunk 045 radial. So all that's doing is giving us options to use conventional navigation to identify fixes on the approach. You'll notice that the only radial coming off of Kennebunk that has the minimum en route altitude and the distance is this 030 radial. That's what tells us it's a feeder route. That's how we know that the 008 radial or the 352 radial, they're not feeder routes. That's how we know that is because it's missing that symbology. The bolded arrow helps, but that's not the only thing that gives us that information. So that 030 radial would take us to Buckstow, which is an intermediate fix that symbolizes the start of the intermediate segment of the approach procedure. Again, there's a whole bunch of information here: intermediate fix, Buckstow, and it can be identified by being on the localizer, IPWM, at 10.6 DME. That's, again, that box symbolizes DME. Mena is over here. It's just an intersection. In this case, it's the final approach fix, although there's not really a good way to know that from just looking at the chart. But it is on the IPWM. Again, that's the localizer at 6.6 DME. So once again, just a whole slew of different ways of identifying the various fixes on this approach.
And I'll point out as well, for those of us who are flying this approach, 95% of the time, maybe even more, you're just going to be getting vectors to final. So all of these different transitions and radials, they probably are things you may not even have known about if you've just flown this IFR in a jet. 95% of the time, it's just vectors to final. You're so far from this fix, cleared for the approach. But as you can see here, there are all kinds of other ways that you can choose to fly this approach. And although Portland isn't the most frequent application for this, when you're flying into smaller airports that may not be towered, that may be into the mountainous regions of Boston Center or areas where there is no approach control, it's very common for the only way that you can fly an approach to be off of an initial approach fix or off of a transition route. So I had a pilot flying into Ogdensburg the other day. Ogdensburg is an airport that's controlled by Boston Center. We have no way of giving vectors there. There's no actual ability to issue you a radar vector. The only way that you can fly an approach is something like this. So it's important for us pilots to be aware of these different means of flying approaches, what this all means. And then if you are flying into Portland, and you could feel free to request direct Kennebunk to fly the approach, and you'd get it and be able to fly that really without any ATC involvement. And of course, when there is no ATC online, this is a great way to be able to practice these skills, and also a very nice, easy, organized way to get yourself to the runway without having to try and self-vector with the GPS and end up not in the place you thought you were.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good example of a little bit of information overload. There's way more information on this chart than we would normally need to fly the approach, but it gives us every option that's available. And that's kind of why the FAA does it like this, right? It's better to give too much information than not enough. And then over here on the right, you have a whole bunch of information. You can see this little symbol here, this kind of bean or egg. It's not really an egg. I don't know how to describe that, but this shape that has dots inside of it, that's the inner marker, which is designated by the IM. And I forget if you guys got into the different marker beacons last time. Evan?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, that's because they're like used in 3 places in the US now.
Yeah, exactly. They're still taught and they're still shown on the chart, but they're honestly not entirely relevant in flying if you have any decent avionics in the airplane. But regardless, it's the inner marker, which is a way of knowing where your minimums are, and a couple other things. We're kind of just going to gloss over that. But that's the inner marker. You can see there's the little 2 bolded lines over here for the different runways at Portland, right? 1129, which is what we're using in this case, and then 3618, which always seems to be closed for some reason whenever we need it. And then there's a whole bunch of different obstacles, and it'll give you this little caret symbol with the dot, and then it'll show you the altitude MSL that those various obstacles and obstructions will go up to. Just off to the right here, you can see there's a dashed line. It kind of goes off the picture here, but that shows a little bit of a visual picture of the missed approach procedure, just in the top-down view, in case you, just to provide an additional level of situational awareness. So here's another example from a different approach. This is an Rnav GPS approach, and it is in somewhere, I don't know. Evan, do you remember where this is?
I will find it. I think it's Bradley.
Yep, that's definitely Bradley. Yep, that's the one. So it looks like the Rnav runway 15 in Bradley, Connecticut. Obviously looks a little bit different, and actually looks a little bit cleaner in this case. But a couple things that are different. For the most part, everything is the same. Everything we just talked about is exactly the same. One thing that's a little different, you'll notice there's a hold here. It's actually called a hold in lieu of procedure turn. It can be used as a means to reverse your course on the final approach course, or it can actually be used as a hold in certain situations. In this case, that hold is altitude restricted, similar to you'd find on an arrival or departure chart. A maximum altitude of 6,000 feet and a minimum altitude of 3,500 feet. That can exist for a variety of reasons, but whatever the reason, I don't know what it is specifically in this case, it's there. Those are the only altitudes you can hold that. Otherwise, that hold is not valid. I mentioned this briefly before, but this little squiggly line that you see here on the line from Chester to Doseb denotes that it is not to scale. So generally speaking, these charts will be to scale to give you a good picture of the varying distances between fixes or points on the approach. In that case, it's not to scale. So you'll notice it's 13.8 miles from Chester to Doseb, but from Sasha to Doseb, it's 13.1 miles. So the distances are virtually the same, but the line from there to there and the line from there to there are clearly not the same. So that's why that exists. It's just to fit everything on one page.
And before you jump to the next one, I should mention as well, and I don't have a box over it, but the no PT is a good one to talk about here as well. So we looked at a previous example on the ILS runway 11 where there was no course reversal. So in all of those examples, you'd fly over the depicted fix, fly to the ILS, intercept it, and fly inbound. Here we have a unique scenario where if you were flying direct to the Doseb initial approach fix, say from somewhere over the airport from the southeast area, you'd be expected to fly that hold in lieu of procedure turn. So just like we talked about in our hold seminar, you'd be doing a hold entry, turn yourself around, and then once you cross Doseb, you'd fly the approach inbound. If you look at over, maybe Krikor can use the mouse to just show us, but from Sasha, you can see that there's not only an altitude, a course, and a distance, but also we have this no PT. And that indicates that although there is a hold depicted at Doseb, we're not required to fly it. So were I to go direct Sasha, the approach clearance might sound like cross Sasha at about 4,000, cleared Rnav runway 15 approach. I would go from Sasha to Doseb to Breen, without actually flying a hold entry. Whereas if I was coming from the opposite direction, somewhere over the airport, then as I said, the expectation would be to fly the hold entry. So that no PT symbol is an important one to note as well. And if there was no symbol there, from Sasha, you'd be expected to fly to Doseb, effectively do one lap in the hold, a direct entry, and then fly the approach.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. There's also notes on the chart. So here it says procedure not authorized for arrival on Chester VOR DME Airways, radial 140 clockwise to 140. Now that's a lot of information. So what does that mean? What that means is essentially if you're arriving on the Chester VOR flying on an airway from a 104 radial, which is, hold on, I'm trying to draw it, but this is not cooperating with me. Okay. Yeah, this isn't working. Okay. So if you're arriving, essentially coming from the southeast, which is what those are, there's some airway, I don't know what it is, coming from the southeast, you can't fly the approach from Chester inbound because that turn is going to be so great that you're not going to be able to remain on the published portion of the approach. So that's all that means. And there's another one down here on Sasha for Victor 292 westbound. So if you're coming on Sasha, or coming towards Sasha rather, from this direction, why would you make a 180-degree turn and go back the other way, right? That's kind of what it's trying to avoid. Down here in the bottom left, we have the minimum safe altitude. You're going to find this on every instrument approach procedure. So if you're within 25 nautical miles, in this case of runway 15, and that's not the runway in general, that's specifically this little Rnav waypoint that's been created here at the threshold. If you're within 25 miles, the minimum safe altitude is 3,300 feet. That altitude guarantees that within that entire 25-mile radius, you will be 1,000 feet above any obstacles if you're in non-mountainous terrain. Now, if you're in any mountainous terrain, as defined by the FAA, it will give you 2,000 feet. And that's a whole other conversation about how they define mountainous terrain. But regardless, that will give you 1,000 feet above any obstacle within that 25 nautical mile radius. It's worth noting that that is not necessarily the lowest practically safe altitude. Air traffic control generally has what's called a minimum vectoring altitude, which is the minimum altitude that they're able to vector and do whatever they want with you at. And that altitude is often lower than this MSA. It provides the same clearance, but they have a much more specific chart. It's not just one altitude for a 50-mile circle. In this case, it's a number of altitudes for different portions within that circle.
And that MSA as well is generally considered an emergency altitude. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee you, for example, the ability to speak with ATC. You might be at 3,300, but in certain regions, you might not actually have radio coverage. So you're guaranteed some obstacle clearance, but it's not really an altitude the FAA recommends that you would base your plans on. So I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, the MSA here is 3,300, so I'm safe to fly at 3,300 through this airspace. You may not be able to talk to Bradley Approach if you were at 3,300 in some areas. So I think this important thing here is this is really designed for, I've just gone missed, for example, and I'm struggling to find the missed approach. What's a safe altitude to get to? Or it's I've had an engine failure somewhere in this region, but I'm using a second engine. How low can I go? It's a really quick reference to find what's a safe altitude to get to. It's not something we want to be incorporating routinely into our planning. Krikor, correct me if I'm wrong.
Nope, that's absolutely right. Sorry, I shouldn't say no, that was a yes, but anyway. English is hard. I'm better at flying airplanes. Moving on.
Be careful. I have fun with you. I wouldn't make that claim.
Okay, fair enough. Here's another example of an MSA. In this case, it's 25 miles from BT, which is a non-directional beacon or an outer marker. It's one of the two. It looks like an NDB. But anyway, there are some cases where we don't have a minimum safe altitude. What do we do? Well, it's okay. The FAA thought about this for us. So with specific procedures, and normally you'll find this with RNAV procedures, you have what's called a TAA, or a terminal arrival area. What does that mean? It's a little bit more complicated, but it effectively does the same thing. So generally, a TAA is for a 30-mile radius, so it's a little bit more than an MSA would be, and it's segmented. So in this case, this is the Rnav 15 into Burlington? Yeah, yep. Burlington. And you can see it's broken up into different quadrants. So you have this 180-degree quadrant over here to the northwest. You've got a 90-degree to the south and a 90-degree quadrant to the east. And those are further broken up with different distances. So effectively, if we're coming anywhere, from the northwest, between the 236 radial and the 056 radial, From 30 miles out, we can descend to 6,600. Then, once we reach 8 miles from stave, the initial approach fix in this case, we can descend to 3,200. So it's very similar to an MSA as far as how it's depicted. You just kind of need to visualize it and think through it a little bit more. The reason this is so nice is the controller, and you'll see this on VATSIM a lot, especially if you get up into the kind of more, or the more sparsely populated areas where there's less air traffic. Air traffic control can tell you from a long ways out, maintain 1,000 until, I believe it's until within the TAA, cleared Rnav runway 15 approach. And so you would descend to 11,000. You would stay at 11,000 until you're 30 miles from stave, at which point you could descend to 6,600 until you're 8 miles from stave, at which point you can descend to 3,200 until you reach stave and then complete the rest of the approach.
And a real practical example of this using Burlington here, the minimum vectoring altitude, so this is the altitude that we as controllers can give you around the UNUT area, is actually about 5,200 feet, depending on where exactly you're coming from. So if you're coming from somewhere sort of southeast of UNUT, if I was to just give you a standard approach clearance, my standard approach clearance would be cross UNUT at or above 5,200, cleared Rnav runway 15 approach. But as you can see, the minimum altitude after you cross UNUT is 3,200. So that's 2,000 feet to lose in only 8 miles. That might put you a little bit high for the Rnav approach. The advantage of being able to give the clearance with the TAA is that I can just tell you I'll maintain 8,000 until established in the TAA. And from that point, you can use these step down altitudes to cross UNUT at 4,600 instead of 5,200. That's enough time for you to be able to safely make that descent to 3,200 and then intercept the, in this case with an Rnav, either the glide path or just the LNAV, and then fly the step downs from there. There's even more significant examples of this at some of the more mountainous airports and some of the further regions of ZBW. But the concept of this TAA is generally that you have the ability to get lower, closer to the waypoint than you would if air traffic control was to give you an altitude, because we're restricted by the minimum vectoring altitude in a certain area, whereas the TAA has looked very precisely at this particular approach and designed something that you know will work from a descent perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Evan. So now we're going to look a little bit at the profile view. So the profile view is, again, it's fairly straightforward and easy to understand, but it shows you a vertical picture of that portion of the approach, when you can descend and stuff like that. So this is, again, back to the ILS, the ILS runway 11 back in Portland, Maine, the one we looked at the beginning. And we're just going to kind of go through all the different parts of this. So at the bottom here, we have distances. So this shows you the distance from the runway threshold of all the different fixes. So you can see from the inner marker, it's 0.2 miles. IPWM here, the visual descent point, which you guys probably talked about last time, is 1 mile from the inner marker. So it's 1.2 miles from the runway threshold. So you need to add them together. 0.6 miles, 3.4, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to add them together to get the different distances of all of these. Now, you may be asking, well, we've got DME up at the top, right? Like Buckstow, it says 10.6 DME. Buckstow is 10.6 miles from IPWM, from the physical localizer that's present at the airport, which is often located at the other end of the runway. So that is not 10.6 miles from the runway threshold. If we were to add it together, we'd get something slightly less than that. And you can actually look over here. So if you go to the runway threshold and work your way up, it'll show you IPWM 1.4 DME. So when you arrive at the runway threshold, you're actually 1.4 nautical miles from the physical localizer antenna that's present at the airport. So that's why they give you that information down there. In the bottom left, it tells you the approach angle. So glide slope is 3 degrees. That's for the ILS approach, and that's pretty typical. 3 degrees is your standard instrument approach. You will find some that are others. For example, the airport that I'm based at, one of the RNAV approaches is 3.75 degrees. So you do see exemptions, or exemptions from that, but it'll tell you that there. And then threshold crossing height, that's what TCH is 59 feet. So if you're perfectly centered on the glide slope, you're going to cross the runway threshold at 59 feet. That's what that information is telling you there. And here we have all the information present for one fix. So again, this is Buckstow. You'll notice the symbology up at the top is very similar to it is in the profile, or in the plan view, excuse me. So Buckstow is the identifier. It's at 10.6 DME from IPWM. And we need to cross Buckstow at or above 2,300 feet, and that's what that 2,300 with the line underneath it symbolizes. It'll show you the final approach course here. That's what the 112 is. And then again, here we have Mena, which is another intersection on the approach, IPWM 6.6 DME. We need to cross it at or above 1,800. Now, one thing that's different with Mena is it's what we call the final approach fix, which is symbolized by this Maltese cross that's present down here for the localizer approach. That final approach fix is often used for company policies as far as speeds and flap settings. Air traffic control will use it for speed settings, and they have requirements to have you at a certain speed by the final approach fix. One thing that is very worth noting here is that final approach fix is different for the ILS and the localizer approaches. And this is something that is often misunderstood and misconstrued, especially in the simulation world. The final approach fix for a non-precision approach, so localizer, RNAV, VOR, any of those type, NDB, any of those type of approaches is symbolized by this Maltese cross, and that's the same on Jefferson charts and government charts. For the ILS approach, however, for any precision approaches, it's actually the glide slope intercept at a specified altitude. So it's the glide slope intercept at 1,800 feet. Now, that's a little bit confusing because in this case, they're actually the same point. You will intercept the glide slope at 1,800 feet when you hit Mena. So in this case, both final approach fixes are coincident, but Mena is not the final approach fix. So that's just a little bit of an important distinction. And we'll have an example here in a minute that shows you when those are different. Up in the right, it shows you a brief view of the missed approach procedure. It does describe the missed approach procedure elsewhere on the chart, but this gives you a quick visual description. So you're going to fly straight ahead to 600 feet, and that's straight ahead. That's the final approach course, not a northbound heading, just to clarify. You're then going to make a climbing right turn to 3,000 to proceed direct to Kennebunk VOR. That's what that's all telling you right there. So there's a little bit of decoding you can kind of put on your Sherlock Holmes hat and figure out what it's trying to tell you there. Down here, we've got a couple other pieces of information. So we have Finus, which is a fix on the approach at 3.2 DME. We have IPWM at 2.6 DME, which is your visual descent point. And it has 700 feet on there, which is a little bit weird. You'll see the asterisk down here and then again up here. So if you're, and then you'll notice over here, asterisk again, loc only. So what does all of that mean? If you're flying the local, this does not apply to the ILS approach. If you're flying the localizer approach only, you need to cross 2.6 DME at or above 700 feet. So you'd fly into Mena, cross Mena at 1,800 feet. At that point, you can descend down to 700 feet, but you can't go below 700 feet until you reach 2.6 DME from the Portland IPWM. So that's what that's all symbolizing. And then down here, you have the visual picture of the missed approach procedure, the runway threshold, like we talked about, 1.4 miles from IPWM. That's what all of that information down there is giving you. Do we have any questions about any of that before we move on?
I want to talk about, sorry, Alan, I know you've got a question as well. I'll get to that in just one second. Krikor, do you want to talk about the missed approach point for a localizer versus an ILS? We sort of talked about that in the last session about the significance of an MDA versus a DA, but just maybe on the profile, or sorry, profile view, if you could explain that one. And then Alan has a question after that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Evan. And this is one thing that I think the Jefferson charts do a little bit better than the FAA charts. But anyway, I digress. So on a precision approach where you have, or anything with vertical guidance, so that includes an RNAV approach with LPV, if you're descending on a glide slope or a glide path, you're going to have a decision altitude. And so you're going to continue down on the glide slope until you hit that decision altitude. And it's usually about 200 or 250 feet above the runway. You're going to descend down, hit that altitude. If you don't have the runway in sight, okay, you go missed. With a non-precision approach, like we talked about, we would cross Mena at 1,800 feet, descend down to 700 until we cross the visual descent point, which is at 2.6 DME. At that point, we would descend down to whatever our minimum descent altitude is, and we would hold that altitude until we hit the predetermined missed approach point, which you'll have to look elsewhere on the chart for. There's usually a time and distance chart that's not shown right here. I'm not sure if there's more than that you wanted to add, Evan.
No, that's good. I guess I was going to point out that, oftentimes it's the runway, which we can see here. So that would either be the 1.4 DME off of Portland, or as you say, if there's a time and distance chart for those who wouldn't have DME. I agree.
Yeah.
Alan, you had a question?
Yeah, about the missed approach. So it's basically On the Kennebunk one, you said we stay at 600 feet, and then after that we take a right turn to 3,000 feet until Kennebunk. But when I'm looking at the one that you have highlighted down there with the dotted line, it looks like it's turning left on the missed approach. So is that a different missed approach?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So that dotted line there is only looking at the vertical aspect. So all that's demonstrating is a climb. This whole profile view is kind of if you're looking at it from the side and you're watching the plane descend. It's not showing you left or right. It's showing you if you're climbing or descending.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Okay, we will move on. Here's another example of a profile view. And the main thing we want to emphasize here is the difference in the final approach fix. So you'll notice the final approach fix, right? That Maltese cross for the localizer portion of this approach is VEALS. The outer marker is what LOM means, location or locator outer marker. So that's the final approach fix for the localizer only approach. However, for the ILS approach, it's the Glideslope intercept at 2,300. And you can tell it because you have 2,300. You've got your little lightning bolt symbol there, and then there's a change in altitude where it intercepts this feather symbol that represents the glide slope. So that's where things are a little bit different. And actually, it tells you right here, that's what that 2163 is. If you're on the glide slope, you're going to cross VEALS at 2,163 feet, which is very specific, I know, but that's the FAA. So that's one example where you can see that difference. It's fairly rare for the most part when you're flying, especially if you're in larger airports. You're going to see the same. They'll be coincident, the final approach fix for the ILS and for the localizer approach, but you will see on occasion an approach like this where they're not actually in the same place.
And the significance of that glide slope check height and also the final approach fix, quote unquote, for an ILS is that there is the potential for a false glide slope to be created. I honestly don't know if this is simulated in most flight simulators or not, but certainly in the real world, glide slopes basically exist at intervals. So if you happen to be at VEALS at about 6,000 feet, you'll actually find that there's a glide slope there that you can capture. And it acts just like a regular glide slope, except it's going to be quite the descent to make it down from 6,000 feet to the runway. And there have been accidents and incidents that have involved people capturing a false glide slope and then pitching over quite quickly into a rapid descent, or even worse than that. So one of the key things that we always do as pilots as we approach the final approach fix, whether we want to use VEALS or we want to use the 2300, but one of the things we always do is we're going to look and see, okay, if we go back to the previous example with Maynard, we use this one. Here I am at VEALS. My altimeter reads 2163 roughly. Therefore, I am on the correct glide slope. If I'm seeing that I'm at VEALS and I'm actually at 6,000, something is very wrong there. So that's a really important check. This question came up on Discord the other day. It is very possible to actually capture a false glide slope if you're crazy high close to the airport. And maybe you're not talking to air traffic control, or you did the procedure turn but you forgot to descend. That's a very real thing that can happen. So double checking whether you're using the final approach fix or somewhere else, but generally the final approach fix, double checking that your altitude makes sense and that in this case you're crossing VEALS at 2163. That's an important check for us to do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Evan. So this is an extended version of a profile view. This is for an approach into somewhere in Alaska, I think
Juneau,
it was.
Yeah, Juneau.
I know this is a little bit more.
If you haven't flown that approach into Juneau, do it. It is awesome.
Very true. Thank you for that. There's a little bit more information. There's some minimum stuff down here, which we'll get to. But one thing that's a little bit different here is this fly visual to airport comment that's over here. So in this case, Evan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this approach is offset from the airport. So you'll descend down, you'll fly in the instrument approach down to Mulry, at which point you need to do that remaining segment visually. There's not going to be any appropriate instrument guidance, the remaining portion to the airport.
Yep, so this is an LNAV only approach, so that makes it a non-precision, and the missed approach point is Mulry. So this is a really cool application of instrument approaches. This is the Rnav, I think it's runway, I forget the runway number, but it's probably runway 8 into Juneau, Alaska, PAJN. And as I say, if you haven't flown this approach, it's a really cool one to just spawn up in the sim on a final approach and fly it. It's actually called the Lda X-Ray Approach. And so actually, this one is probably the Rnav, so it'd be the Rnav Victor runway 8 approach into Juneau it is. And so you basically it is slightly offset, but it's also brings you in quite high because there is about 600-foot peak just off the left side, and you're effectively flying this approach onto an airport that's on a plateau. So it's a really, really fun approach to fly.
Yeah.
So as you can see, the missed approach point is Mulry. Effectively, what this approach is designed to do is bring you to Mulry at the minimum altitude of, depending on your aircraft capability and exactly what's going on, somewhere between 2,300 and 1,900 feet. And when you're at that point at 1,900 feet, you need to then break off and effectively fly a visual approach, because there's just no way for them to design an instrument approach that gives you enough clearance from the terrain that's nearby. It's an absolutely stunning approach in a beautiful area, and it's one of those one in, one out airports where you basically have got one shot at it, and if you hit Mulry and you don't see the airport, you better be climbing in a hurry, because there's a whole lot of terrain on the other side of the airport you don't want to be getting too close to.
Yeah, you see some weird stuff in Alaska. There's one approach that I've seen probably on Bold Method or something, where it basically says if you execute a missed approach after the missed approach point, the chances of a successful go around are unlikely. I don't remember exactly what the phrasing is, but it's something a little bit dark like that. All right, so we're going to move on and talk a little bit about briefing and approach. So an instrument approach briefing is an essential part of flying IFR. If you're doing instrument training in the real world, this is something that every instructor should harp on. It's much like a routine flight, right? A good flight starts with a good briefing, having a good mental picture of what's going to happen, and then being appropriately set up for it. So it's a good way to prepare the airplane and the crew to make sure that both are set up completely for the approach. So before you brief an approach, you want to do a couple of things. You want to verify the weather conditions. So make sure that there's actually a chance of landing. If there's overcast clouds at 100 feet and you're at a Skyhawk, and minimums are 400 or 500 feet, probably not going to get in, right? So make sure that there's actually a chance of being able to conduct the approach. It doesn't necessarily need to be way above minimums. It doesn't even need to be at minimums in some cases. But if there's no chance of being able to make it in, why even bother wasting the time and fuel and energy conducting the approach? PIREPs are very helpful. Automated weather sometimes lies. 3 miles of visibility is a lot less than what you think 3 miles of visibility is. So if there's anyone who's done the approach before you and is able to say, oh yeah, we had no problem, or yeah, we barely made it in, that's a really useful tool to make sure the approach is actually safe and doable. Read the notes. This is important on an approach. You don't need to brief all the notes. In fact, I usually don't brief all the notes, but people miss important notes all the time. My favorite example of this is the ILS runway 4 into New York LaGuardia. There's a note that says something like autopilot coupled approaches not authorized. Yeah. The reason for that is there's a highway right near the localizer antenna that interferes with the signal, and it'll swing back and forth. And pilots deviate themselves all the time in the real world flying this approach. Like I heard a story about a Delta pilot, and they were kind of going back and forth, and the tower asked them, hey, Delta 2072, how you guys doing? You're kind of, going back and forth here. And the guy was like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. The autopilot just keeps going back and forth. He's like, okay, possible pilot deviation. They are important. They're easily overlooked. It's a lot like the NOTAM system in the FAA, where things are sometimes there that are not super important. But if you miss an important note, it's going to be a bad day. So that's really important to look at before an instrument approach briefing. Set up the airplane. Before you brief the approach, work through it in your head. Get everything set up in the FMS or the GPS or whatever you had. Communication radios are a big one. You can get a sense of if you're on the approach frequency that's listed in the box. That's usually the final approach frequency. So you can start to get tower set up, maybe get ground set up. That gives you a little bit of a heads up. Navigation radios, if you're flying an ILS, a localizer, a VOR, something with a ground-based nav aid, get it programmed in, get it identified, get that set up ahead of time. If you're flying a GPS approach, or you have a GPS, use it as a backup. Program the approach and get everything set up the way you need to have it. If you're receiving radar vectors to join the final approach course, set the final approach course in. If you're flying in a GPS-based airplane and you're getting radar vectors to join the final approach course, go in the GPS and actually activate vectors to final, because you may as well get things set up early. Set altitudes and minimums if you have a minimums bug in your airplane. Most transport category airplanes, if not all of them, have a minimums bug. Set that. That's a beautiful visual reminder. It gives you so much situational awareness having that on your altitude tape or your altitude indicator. Timers, if there's any timers required for the approach, you can get those set up. Really, everything that you can get set up for the approach, get it set up before you brief it. And then during the briefing, use that as an opportunity to cross-check that everything you set up was done correctly. When you go to brief an approach, there's a couple different ways of doing it. Everyone does these a little bit differently, but really you want to work through the entire approach chart to make sure that you have a good picture of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. If you're flying with other crew members, you want to make sure that you're on the same page. You don't have any questions about the approach. You guys know what you're going to do. You know how you're going to do it. This is a great opportunity to get things set up. A lot of people do their briefings differently if they're in a single pilot environment or if they're in a crew environment. Personally, I do it the same. I kind of treat myself as a crew and use that as an opportunity to make sure that I haven't missed anything or done anything wrong. But the briefing should be a fluid way of going through the entire chart. So you're going to talk about really everything important on the chart, the final approach course, how you're going to join the final. So if you're getting radar vectors or you're on a feeder route or you're doing a procedure turn, anything like that. The final approach fix altitude, the minimum safe altitude, descent angle gradient, MDA or DA, whichever is applicable for your approach, whatever the missed approach point is, and then what you're going to do in the event of a missed approach. There's, like I said, a number of different methods of doing this. I like to literally read through the chart, top to bottom, left to right, and go over everything that's important and applicable.
Well, the Krikor is going to go through a couple of examples of this, but I want to stress that this is extremely invaluable for the flight simulator pilot as well. Most of the time we're flying single pilot IFR. That doesn't change the fact that doing a briefing is important. So as you are in cruise somewhere with a safe distance back from the airport before you're going to start your descent, this is all the kind of thing you want to be thinking about. Let's grab the ATIS, let's put the approach in, and let's talk through how is this actually going to work. If you're expecting radar vectors, you're going to talk about what are the risks associated with that. If you're thinking you might fly the approach from a certain waypoint, you'll talk through that. Effectively, even though you're flying on your own, as Krikor says, it's a great idea to think of yourself as the other crew member. And so when I'm flying in the simulator, when I'm flying single pilot IFR, I'm always taking 3-4 minutes at some point while I'm back in cruise at a safe place to think, this is my plan of action from the time that I start descending until the time that I am on the ground, parked at my destination on the airport. And if something doesn't go according to plan, here's what I intend to do about that. This is something that we should be thinking about anytime we fly an instrument approach, or even a visual approach, or even a VFR approach to the airport. Every airline I've flown in, including the small airlines where we have 2 pilots and an airplane that might seat 3 passengers, we are talking about, even for a VFR approach, what is the plan? What's it going to look like? What are we going to do if things don't go according to plan? So this is a great habit to be getting into for us simulator pilots, so that ideally we aren't being taken by surprise.
Absolutely. And the idea is to really get a good mental picture of what's going on. When you hear the words, turn right heading 010, maintain 3000, clear the ILS, runway 48 approach, you just do it. You don't have to think about anything. You already know what you're doing. You know how you're doing it. It's programmed. That's really the idea. This is a real world skill. Like I said, this is going to make VATSIM flying and real world flying significantly easier. So I'm going to talk you guys through an approach briefing here using the ILS runway 11 approach and Hanscom field in Bedford, Massachusetts. And then we're going to have you guys do a couple approach briefings and kind of try and get a feel for it. And Evan and I will provide some feedback, and then we'll go from there. So once again, we're just going to, at least the way I do it, is basically read through the approach top to bottom and go through all the important stuff. So it's the ILS runway 11 approach at Hanscom, Massachusetts. The plate is valid until 10 September 2020, so it is indeed valid. The primary navigate is IBED 111.15. That's been tuned and identified. The final approach course is 113. We've got 7,011 feet of runway available. Touchdown zone elevation is 132. Airport elevation is 132. We're expecting radar vectors to join the final approach course. Final approach fix is Jopvu at or above 1,800, at which point we'll join the glide slope and descend to the ILS DA of 383 feet with a 2,400 foot RVR or 1/2 mile visibility. In the event of a missed approach, climb to 1,000, then a climbing left turn to 2,000 on a heading of 020 to join, 060 to join the Boston VOR 329 radial to Swig intersection and hold, and then continue the climb and hold to 2,000. And then if I'm flying with a crew, I will specifically ask, do you have any questions? and we'll go through and discuss anything that I missed or anything that they're unfamiliar with. Another thing that's good to brief is the type of approach lighting system, and I didn't include that because I don't like where the government charts include that. It's a little bit easier with the JEP charts, but that's another good thing to include, is if there's an approach lighting system and kind of what you're looking for as you get near minimums. Evan, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's great, and I'll give you the airline perspective on a briefing in a couple minutes when we look at the Boston approach. But from the perspective of what you've explained, I think that's great. And obviously, if we are sitting in the airplane with Krikor, as he's saying, the approach frequency is 111.15, we're going to look at the nav radio and make sure that's what's actually in there. We might even make sure that that's been tuned and identified because he said it had been. Similarly, if we are looking at the missed approach, as Krikor is speaking out what the missed approach is, I might look at the GPS and make sure that those are actually the things that are programmed in there. So if we do in fact have to go missed, we've got that stuff set up. So as Krikor said earlier, this is a cross-check for us. It's not just listening to him and saying, yep. It's he says this, and I go actually check, yes, this is in fact set up in the airplane. That's really the purpose of this. So if you're flying single pilot, the key is you're saying the localizer is 11.15, but you're doing the check of the nav1 radio to make sure that that is actually programmed in and that you're actually receiving it as you expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I try and treat it a little bit like a conversation, even if it's a conversation with yourself. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but a lot of people, when they do these briefings, it's very jerky. It's very awkward. You know, you're stating one thing at a time, and I find it works a lot better if you kind of flow. And this is one of those things where practice makes perfect. The more you do it, you'll develop a flow and an order of saying things. I have mine that I do the same way every single time, regardless of the approach, and that makes a huge difference in how easy it is to brief these things.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so here we have the Rnav GPS Zulu runway 29 into, once again, Hanscom, Massachusetts. Does anyone here want to try their hand at doing this approach briefing?
Who's brave enough to get the wrath of me and Krikor judging your approach briefing?
The wrath of Kiki is quite scary. I'm just kidding. It's not.
Anyone who wants to do it, unmute your microphone and let's give it a try. Someone here's got to be brave enough. I'm gonna make somebody do it if nobody says anything else.
Whoever does it will get a piece of my chocolate cake the next time we meet up.
Sweet
I see Andrew.
cake.
All right, Andrew, let's hear it.
All right, I gotta make this quick because I'm flying to Salt Lake. So, all right, we got the Rnav GPS Zulu runway 29er approach. The approach course 293. We're gonna cross Morris at or above 1,800, JZ 1,800, Roger at or above 1,000. And I'm just going to say for this, we're going to be LPV mins all the way down, minimum 328 feet for a category of airplane. A missed approach point will be on the GPS for us. Missed approach will be climb to 2,000 direct common and track 2, 9, or 7 to so and hold. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. What do you think, Krikor?
Yeah, that was pretty good. This is a good example, aside from the briefing. This is a really good example of a just stupid amount of notes that are really not applicable to most of what you're doing. So once again, a good thing to review, but a lot of the time there's just so much stuff there that it's kind of exhausting to read through it.
And I've flown with people who will literally read every single note there, and they're talking about, below minus 16 degrees Celsius when it's the middle of the summer, it's 35, and it's like, do I really need to be talking about this right now? So the one thing though that Krikor says this quite correctly, if there's an important note, you can guarantee it'll be buried right in the middle of that paragraph. It won't be at the beginning or the end. It'll be right in the middle, right where you want to gloss over it. So it is truly important to read through those. But as I say, and Krikor said as well, I wouldn't be briefing stuff that's totally irrelevant, but you certainly want to make sure you've actually talked through it at the very minimum. One thing that's interesting about Rnav approaches, and I suppose it applies to any approach, but it's really obvious here, is to talk about how you are going to fly the approach. So we didn't give Andrew that information, but we might be getting vectors. We might be planning to fly the approach off of the SEGO initial approach fix. We might be going another route. So it's important to think about that as well. And if you don't know the answer, that's another thing to talk about. So we might be getting vectors, we might be getting direct CGO. For now, I've got CGO in the GPS, but if we do get vectors to final, I'll just activate that in the GPS. That might be something that you tell the other crew member, or that you just tell yourself as you're getting set up for this particular approach. And again, we don't know what air traffic control has planned for us. So it's important to be able to think, well, here are the possible options. I'm going to set the airplane up so that if they do clear me direct CGO, I'm ready for it. But if I need to just go back to vectors to final, that's an easy change in my GPS. Whereas if I set up the approach with vectors to final and all I have is JC, and all of a sudden Boston Approach says clear direct CGO, and you're struggling to put that back into the GPS. So it's important to be thinking about these kinds of things as you're setting up approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Good point, Seven. So we'll move on here and look at a Jefferson chart. So you'll notice things look a little bit different. There's a bunch of the same information that's displayed differently, and there's some different information, and there's one or two very small things that are actually missing and done differently on these. So again, we've got the setup on the left here. So check the NOTAMs, get the ATIS and the weather, the expected runway, make sure this is actually the approach we think we're going to be flying. And that's a really key thing. And this is something that I've observed that students struggle with in the real world is planning ahead and thinking about stuff. So you can start to set up for an approach a ways away without asking the controller what the active runway is. This is a big VATSIM thing, right? We hear it all the time on Boston Center. We'll have someone going into Kennedy and they'll say, hey, what's the active runway? And the response is, I don't know, because we don't.
The other day, thing is, I had a plane. They were in Moncton Center airspace, so they were at least 500 miles away from their destination, which was Toronto. So they're in Moncton Center, 500 miles from Toronto, and they asked me, what is the active runway in Toronto? And I'm like, that's not even in this country, let alone anywhere in my airspace. I have no idea.
So there are a couple strategies for this. You can pull the ATIS, and even if you're not able to hear it, you can type .ATIS space KJFK underscore ATIS. It's a VATSIMism. In the real world, you can use CPDLC. There's other ways of pulling this information that aren't available on VATSIM, but you can get it on VATSIM. Get a textual version of the ATIS that you can sit there and read and spend 3 hours figuring out which runway it is. Oftentimes at larger airports like Boston or like Kennedy, there will be multiple runways in use at the same time. So you can kind of start to think about, hey, if we're coming in from the west, we're probably going to get the more westerly runway, or you may just get familiar with an airport and know which runway they traditionally use. There's little stuff like that that you can use to piece together a runway. But the point is you can figure that out well ahead of the time. And airline pilots, Evan, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but traditionally will program in what they expect while they're at cruise, or sometimes even on the ground before they take off. And if they get a different assignment from approach, they will reprogram, rebrief, and get reset up.
Exactly. And so when you're flying to Atlanta, you can guarantee that happens every time.
Yep. So you can do all that, load the approach into the FMS or the GPS, whatever your airplane has, set the frequencies. So in this case, ILQN, excuse me, I don't know how to read, 110.3, you can set the final approach course to 215, bug your minimums, 216 MSL, and make sure that you have the approach and the missed approach loaded in the FMS. So you can do all of that stuff before you even start to brief the approach. Then you go and do the approach briefing. So once again, you want to come up with a standard, a briefing strip is a good place to start. Wow, I'm scratching my head on this one. Evan, you want to take this?
Briefing strip. It's if you look on the left side, top left of the chart, there's a little briefing strip. It's a Jefferson specific thing, and it basically has the localizer frequency and the missed approach. Those two boxes are the briefing strip.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that. Okay, good to know.
Yeah, actually, it's probably that whole section, even including the notes and the altimeter setting and the MSA. That's what Jefferson calls their briefing strip, and they're very proud of it.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Good to know. Review the notes like we talked about, right? There's often stuff buried there that's important. It's really easy to overlook that stuff, but the day that you overlook something important and get violated for it, or, God forbid, make a mistake that causes an incident or an accident, it's going to be serious. Brief what's relevant and for the conditions. So sometimes there's stuff that's on there, like Evan said, right? If it talks about uncompensated baro VNAV systems below like 16 degrees or minus 16 Celsius, and it's the middle of the summer, probably don't need to talk about that very much. Not really applicable because it's not minus 16 unless the ice age has arrived. And then talk about the approach, but also the landing and taxi to parking. I don't fly for an airline, but the way I like to do it is a separate secondary briefing that discusses the runway, the lengths available, how we're exiting the runway, how we're going to get to the FBO, any hot spots, that kind of thing. And again, Evan, you can feel free to chime in here on how you guys do it, but have some sort of a briefing for a plan for once you get on the ground, so you don't land on runway 22 left and make a left turn as if you're going to go out into the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, exactly. So our briefings are not just instrument approaches, which is what we're talking about today, but we'll start with briefing the arrival procedure, then the instrument approach, and then as Krikor says, we'll talk about how we're going to taxi to the ramp. And there may be other considerations. When I was flying for a small airline and we kind of did everything, we would be talking about who's going to take the passengers in, who's going to grab the baggage. You know, whatever's relevant to the particular operation is what you want to talk about. But I do want to stress the importance of thinking about what happens after we land. You know, as pilots, we think, okay, let's get the airplane on the ground. But now you've landed on 22 left and you turn left and there's no terminal there. There's just water, right? So let's take a moment after we've talked about the approach and we've figured out that we're going to land. Well, what's the plan? Where do we want to try to exit? And really trying to land in a way that suits where you want to exit is important. I'm not saying land 3/4 of the way down the runway because you want to go to the FBO at the end of it. But if your plan is to exit on the high-speed pop-out, you know, land in accordance with that. So you're spending minimum time on the runway, still land in the first third of the runway, still use the brakes that you need. But when you realize that you're going to be able to get stopped, maybe you just light up on the brakes a little bit so you can exit on that taxiway that you want. Nothing worse for the controller and particularly for the pilot behind you when you land, you slam on the brakes and you realize, oh, actually I want to be at the other side of the airport, and you spend the next 2 minutes on the runway at 15 knots going as slow as you possibly can. So think about that stuff as you're trying to brief this approach and as you're getting set up, because that's really important when you're actually on the airport and there's a guy barreling down behind you on a 1 mile final who really doesn't want to go around.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. That's a great point. Oops, wrong button. Evan, if you want, go ahead and give us the airline style briefing of a Jefferson approach. You guys will notice it's a little bit different than a kind of what you'd see on a general aviation perspective or a Fed chart.
Sure, and I'll talk about this from the perspective of it's daytime and it's good weather. And I might add some things if it was night or if there was some bad weather to talk about. Of course, I will have also talked about the NOTAMs, any company-specific procedures, the arrival, and I would have talked as well about the airport itself, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Krikor is going to be my co-pilot here, so I'm going to ask him a couple of questions as we go. But we're flying the ILS runway 22 left approach at Boston. It's on page 11-3, effective the 26th of March. Have you got that approach in front of you, Krikor?
I do, yes.
Perfect. So we're going to be looking for India, Lima, Quebec, November on 110.3, final approach course of 215. And as I'm saying these things, I'm going to look down. We actually, in our airplane, have the ability to auto-tune. So we type in ILQN. That guarantees that we're on the correct procedure. And we put a preview up of 215. So I'm going to look and say 215 is previewed on my side. Is it previewed on your side, Krikor?
It is.
All right, the Glideslope crossing is 1,700 at focus. I've got ILSDA of 216. I have 220 barrel set on the left. Krikor, you have 220 barrel set on the right.
And 220 barrel set on the right.
Air elevation is 19 feet. The MSA off the Boston VOR is 2,500. Our missed approach, climb to 3,000, outbound on the Boston VOR radial 219 to the Winnie intersection and hold. As I say those words, Krikor is going to look at our FMS and make sure that those waypoints and those procedures are there. You're flying single pilot in a GA airplane. You're probably looking at your GPS to make sure that that's actually there. I'll say I reviewed the notes. They're pretty standard. If there was anything special, I'd talk about it. These two notes are on every single ILS I fly anywhere in the world, so I'm not going to talk about those today. Our glide slope is a 3-degree glide slope. There's a PAPI on the right side of runway 22 left. And basically, that's all I'm going to talk about if we're dealing with good weather conditions in daytime. If it was night, I'd talk about the fact that there's a Mauser so we can know which runway we're identifying. If it was bad weather, I'd be talking about the fact that the RVR is 4,000 feet. We might look at what is the RVR, and I would spend a little bit more time on this approach. So if I'm flying this approach and the RVR is reported at 5,000, I'm going to say the RVR is 4,000. Our minimum requirement is 4,000. If we hear that the RVR is anywhere below 4,000 anytime on the approach, we'll execute the missed approach. And I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the missed approach. So I'll say, in the event of a missed approach, I'm going to press the toga button. The airplane's going to go into FMS mode. We'll follow the FMS guidance. I'll call gear up, flaps up, etc. Right? So we want to be thinking and talking about stuff that's relevant. If it's a clear weather day, and if there is nothing going on, I'll talk about the missed approach just so we're aware of it. And in case we end up having to do a go around for traffic, we have that in the system, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The key is to brief stuff that's relevant to your operation. And then, of course, once we've actually landed, I'll say my plan is to land, exit on Papa, join Echo, and hold short of runway 22 right. After that, we can expect a crossing instruction, and from there, we'll plan to taxi to our gate, which is going to be Bravo 3. That's the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about. And again, I really want to stress, brief what's relevant, brief what you expect to happen, make sure that you have a plan for flying the approach, executing the missed approach should you need to do that, and what are you going to do when you safely land on the runway so that you're not totally lost when you get there.
And you'll notice there's a huge element here of ensuring that both crew members are on the same page. And Evan did a really good job of that, of getting me into the conversation by asking questions and making sure I had the same thing set and we were on the same page. That's something you don't see a lot in the GA environment. He did not just brief the approach and ask if I had any questions. He actually got me involved in the process. And so that's generally not super applicable on VATSIM. That's not something you're going to run into a lot since we're normally doing single pilot ops. But if you do find yourself flying with another pilot or in the real world, that is a very, very valuable skill. Evan, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you covered it all. That's exactly what it is. It's a matter of making sure everyone's on the same page. And honestly, it's checking ourselves. A number of times I've been mid-briefing, especially to an airport that we go to all the time, and I'm like, the final approach course is 215, and I look down and I'm like, oh, I didn't have that set up. I should probably do that now, right? So it's this matter of we're not just saying these words. We're not just reading off the chart. We are looking at the plan we made. We're making sure the airplane matches up with the plan we made, and we're setting ourselves up for success. And so taking your time to do this at a safe point when you're in cruise is fantastic. Of course, we fly into Boston a fair bit when they're advertising both 27 and 22 left. I'm pretty good at guessing which one we're going to get, but it changes sometimes. So that's another point I want to highlight. And we'll talk about this in the next session as well. Don't be afraid when that changes. If you get the ILS runway 22 left set up back at your destination airport and you show up at Boston Approach and they're like, well, expect ILS runway 27. Sorry, you briefed the wrong approach. It's not a big deal. Put in runway 27 and do the same thing over again. It's a lot of work when you're single pilot, but for that reason, we as controllers try to be as helpful as we can. We'll try to give you the approach early. And by all means, if you're flying into an airport like Portland or Bradley, anywhere that's non-approach controlled, if it's not an event, and you've set up for a runway and we tell you something else, feel free to ask for the other one. We'll be able to give it to you 95% of the time. Today we were landing 22 left at Boston. Somebody said, hey, can I fly the 15 right approach? There was no traffic, so sure, I gave it to them. It's not always going to be possible, and if you're flying into Boston and we've got a bunch of traffic for 22 left, no, we're not going to give you 4 right, but if there's an opportunity to do it, we'll try our best.
Yeah, that's a great point, Evan. All right, guys. Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. This is the second to last, unfortunately, of the ground schools that we're running this time around, but we hope you'll join us next Monday at the same time, where we're going to talk specifically about RNAV, area navigation, what that is, arrivals, departures, and approach procedures, and kind of delve a little bit more into that topic. So we hope you guys have enjoyed yourselves tonight. We'll stick around here for a couple minutes to answer any questions that you may have. But otherwise, thank you for listening to me ramble for the past hour and 10 minutes, and look forward to seeing you next week.